for the Toronto Island Ferry. He's been involved in the Bentway project. There's hardly anything exciting around the waterfront that he hasn't been involved in. He grew up mostly in and around the boroughs of New York, eventually moved to Toronto. He's worked on waterfront revitalization projects, not only in Toronto, but in Amsterdam, in New York, Boston, Montreal, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., St. Paul, Minnesota, and many other places. He's the author of Walking Home, which is a book I very much recommend. Put up at Random House, which is basically his thoughts on urbanization, kind of a memoir of projects and initiatives, many of them taken under David Crombee, who I think is here today. I think I saw him on the screen, and we welcome him. Ken has recently come up with another book called Toronto Reborn, Design Successes and Challenges, published by Dundurn, which I also have read and very much recommend. He became a member of the Order of Canada in 2020. So he is one of the most interesting urbanists, I think, in the world today. We are very fortunate to have him today. We also have Ton Schaap. Ton Schaap is a graduate of the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam. He graduated in 1982. He teaches there now. He is one of the senior planners in the city of Amsterdam, involved in projects there, which he'll tell us about, but they include the second phase of the Amsterdam Iberg project, which is essentially the River Eye being the very large body of water just to the north of the city of Amsterdam that you may have visited, where all the beautiful canals are. And what's happening there, as I understand it, is that a primarily industrial area is being turned into living space, places for people to live and work. So it's somewhat analogous to the developments that we have going on around Toronto with the creation of Villiers Island and so on. So thank you very much for joining us, Ton, at a late hour where you are, but we are very excited to hear from you. So I'll turn it over to Ken.
Okay, I'll just load up the front page of your presentation, Ken.
Okay, thank you.
1 second. Just get that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the very kind introduction, Ed. When Edward and Ed approached me about this series, which I thought was a fantastic idea, they asked about someone else who might join, and I immediately thought of Ton Schaap. I had worked in Amsterdam for several years, some 25 years ago, on the redevelopment of the banks of the River Eye, and at that time I got to know Ton working with the city's physical planning department, and got to know his work. And more recently, my wife Etienne, visiting Amsterdam, had a really extraordinary tour with Ton, looking at the work that he's doing on the north banks. I had been previously working on the south banks, and we were really struck by the extraordinary things that were going on there. So when we got together to talk about how we would combine these two talks, we came up with this idea of Objets, Trouvees, or found objects on the waterfront, which is something both of our waterfronts have in common, which is how each city works with what it has on the ground and reinterprets previous layers. So you can go to the next. Well, cities periodically reinvent themselves on their waterfronts. Typically, these are their places of origin. And every period in history leaves traces, palimpsests, and found objects reflecting past lives. And here you see 3 snapshots of Toronto Front Street, the original Front Street, in the top image with the early colonial city, the vast expansion of landfill out into the lake, early 20th century, and of course, a more recent shot of the Toronto skyline across the water. Next. So this, for the past few decades, what we've seen is a remarkable reclamation of the Toronto waterfront. It's been going on literally all across the waterfront, from Mimico, I should even say, from Mississauga to the Scarborough Bluffs and beyond, building on these traces. And this is a model that Waterfront Toronto has put together, showing the extent of that ongoing change. Next. So three things are happening as this occurs. And essentially, we rediscover our waterfront. In doing so, we rediscover ourselves, and the city fills in. So this is a snapshot of the Harborfront Center. You see in the background what used to be the old terminal warehouse, where I worked as an architecture student for a small firm that was run by my professors, now Queens Quay Terminal, the power plant, and what was the Direct Winters Trucking Terminal, now Harborfront Center. And none of these things would be quite like they are had it not been for those found objects and the way in which they were reinterpreted. Next. So looking at a larger picture, what happened in Toronto is, with the mid-20th century, we had a retreat of what I sometimes refer to as the industrial glacier, for reasons technological, economic, obsolescence, revealing a vast new terrain of availability and resources right in the heart of the city. And in our case, quite literally. I've just been muted. I don't know how much you missed.
It was just a second. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Okay, so then keep going to the next. And so if you look at these two snapshots of the waterfront from Google Earth, 2002, 2015, you can see the extent of the change, where the waterfront goes from being an isolated fringe, separated from the city, to quite literally being in the heart of the city, combined with new layers of development some 13 years later. Next. I'm really pleased that my friend and colleague, and I would say mentor, David Crombee, is on this call, because since the 1980s, we have been really fortunate in Toronto to be guided by a set of values that David Crombee articulated in his Waterfront Regeneration Trust, simply as clean, green, accessible to all. And this has served as a set of powerful guideposts for us ever since. Next.
Oh, sorry. Hang on. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
Pardon me. Something just odd just happened. Bear with us for a second. Okay. Oh, let's see, share. Hang on. Okay. Sorry. We have to just had a little glitch there. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but we'll get back on track. Hang on. Oh, okay. 1 second. Sorry about that, people. Okay. I'm gonna have to. All right. There we are. Okay. Ken, do you want the screen after this?
Yeah, can you bring the screen back? I'm not seeing it.
Oh, you're not seeing it.
No.
Oh, okay. I'll try it again. Okay, here we go again. Let's make this. Are you seeing it now? Because according to me, I'm sharing the screen. No?
Not yet.
Okay. I apologize for the technical glitches. Okay, I'll start. Okay. Just bear with us for 1 second. Something.
If all else fails, I can grab the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's okay. I occasionally, Zoom's an amazing tool, but it isn't always perfect. Okay. Do you see it now? There we are.
Okay, go to the next. So one of the things that David Crombee did, which was incredibly powerful, is to shift the focus from thinking of the Toronto waterfront as a narrow band of shoreline to an entire system of watersheds extending right up to the Oak Ridges Moraine, making, in fact, every part of the Toronto region a waterfront site, if you want to think about it that way, and really calling our attention to the underlying natural heritage. So speaking of things that we found that we have inherited, that natural heritage is the most profound and significant layer that we are now reinterpreting. Next. We have been, again, lucky in Toronto that we have an organization called Waterfront Toronto. This is a highly resilient organization. It's been around since 2001. And it was originally developed for an Olympic bid, which did not succeed. But through political administration after political administration, and those of you from Toronto will recognize previous generations of politicians, municipal, federal, and provincial, it has continued to provide guidance as we've undergone this massive change with a commitment to community engagement and also calling attention to those found resources. Next. So what results when you work in this way is remarkable contrasts as you see the different layers of history superimposed on each other. So one of my favorite places is Sugar Beach. I absolutely love the idea of sitting in a Muskoka chair under one of those big umbrellas, looking across the way and seeing the ships unloading sugar to Redpath Sugar. That juxtaposition of the industrial port, previous life, and this new life is one of the things that makes the waterfront so special. Next. At an even bigger scale, this is the competition that I worked on that Ed mentioned for what we called then the Lower Don, bringing a new mouth of the river through an estuary out into the harbor. And this competition was about holistically solving a whole series of problems: flood-proofing, urban development, park creation, urban infrastructure, new mobility, interaction with the water, sustainable development. But in essence, go to the next slide. What really inspired it was going back in time to the point when the Toronto Portlands, the some 800 acres of the Toronto Portlands, had actually been the largest wetlands on the Great Lakes, filled in 1912 by the Toronto Harbor Commission for an industrial era that never materialized quite for a number of reasons. And now a new opportunity to go back to that natural heritage and solve a flood-proofing problem and a whole host of other problems that I mentioned by creating this new river mouth with generous parklands. Next. So here you see this massive construction project that is currently underway. You can see in the curvilinear forms the river, which is reappearing, this natural feature, literally a ghost from the past, reappearing in the Toronto waterfront. Next. Here's another example of reinterpretation: Queen's Quay, which I remember from the era of the terminal warehouse as a heavy industrial street with rail traffic, heavy rail running right down the middle of the street into a series of spurs and right into the terminal warehouse building. It goes through several generations of reinterpretation. Streetcars come onto the street, and then finally another international competition to redefine the street as what you see here, this very generous pedestrian cycle greenway, and the link which ties together the waterfront across the Central Harbor. Next. And here are some images of the life which it now supports. And so this found infrastructure is now reflecting an entirely different set of societal priorities. Next. So now I'm going to talk about the Bentway, which is one of the most extraordinary projects I've had the privilege to be involved in. And this is another case of an objet trouvé, a found object on the waterfront. Next. So in 2011, I wrote a little piece in a journal published by the Friends of Fort York called the Fife and Drum. And I was watching all these new high-rise neighborhoods appearing, which you see in the image. This was a much earlier time, obviously. A great deal of City Place is not there. The Fort York neighborhood is just starting to appear, as is Liberty Village. But I imagine that the 43 acres, the legacy of Fort York, which was on the original harbor. So where you see the expressway running along, that was the short line. Fort York was guarding the entrance to the harbor. At that time, a peninsula, not yet an island where Toronto Island is. And that 43 acres and the space under the Gardner, I imagined, could become a new central park for these emerging neighborhoods. Little did I know, go to the next, that there would come an opportunity to actually make that happen. So this is an image of the Gardner Expressway being built when this was all industrial. So you can see Molson's, you can see the old Maple Leaf Stadium, you can see the Canada Malting in full operation, all of these industrial properties, Fort York barely surviving the highway, which was pushed slightly to the side to preserve it after strong citizen protests. But it was the space under the Gardner that was so interesting. Next. And so this is a case where this was a slogan from the French student actions in 1968, sous les pavés de la plage, under the paving stones, there's a beach. And here we see the beach along the banks of the Seine, which happens every summer. I hope will happen now in this summer in the time of COVID. But again, the reinterpretation of an historic layer. And this was kind of the inspiration. Next. So this was the sketch that I put in that little article in 2011, showing all the new development appearing in the orange color and this new Central Park emerging on the Fort York grounds and under the Gardner itself. Next. This is Masaduchon with this whole idea of seeing things that are so familiar, but with absolutely fresh eyes, and applying this to looking at the legacy of found spaces, found objects as reimagined places. Next. So this is the way I was looking at the Gardner, and oddly enough, the proportions of what was considered this extremely ugly intrusion across our waterfront, and in some ways it was, but almost 15 meters high, 24 meters wide, creating this magnificent canopy, which can be likened to the great arcades and colonnades of antiquity. Next. So the opportunity here was how to reappropriate that space. Next. And so in 2015, with an extraordinary act of civic generosity, I was approached by Judy and Will Matthews. Judy had been a colleague of mine at the City of Toronto, a city planner, and she and her husband were great benefactors of the public realm in the city, having worked on the music garden, the transformation of St. George on the university campus. They were looking for a legacy project. Etienne and I took them down for a walk under the Gardner, which you saw a moment ago. And we talked about this vision for what it could be. And lo and behold, they saw the same thing that I and we had seen. Next.
Sorry, hang on. Sorry.
So this was a drawing that was prepared with my young colleagues from Public Work, whom I brought into the picture very quickly, working with Will and Judy. I was contacted first in April. By July, we went to see the two councillors, Councillor Cressy, Councillor Layton, and Mayor Tory, and we showed this image of what this could be, reconceiving the undercroft of the highway as a new public space. Next. And what was so interesting about this is it was revealing the Garrison Creek, which had literally come down on the edge of Fort York. You can see where the harbor was. If you squint, you can see the lake, that bluish tone right next to Fort York. And so this particular spot was so interesting because it embodied pretty much every layer of the city's history. Go to the next. So here, it had the capacity to tell all of these stories. The echoes of all these past lives were embodied at this particular spot. Next. And so it was about literally connecting all these pieces of the emerging world. It turned out to be an extraordinarily useful device, which had we not found it, we never could have afforded to create this great urban colonnade, this civic space in this location. But all of these thin red lines, along with the thick red line of the undercroft of the Gardner, are part of the Bentway network. Some of these existed, many of them have been created since. Next. So who would have imagined that this highway built in the mid-20th century, essentially to carry cars and trucks, would end up providing shelter for this great civic living room. Next. And serving, by now, nearly 125,000 residents who have come to live in all these vertical neighborhoods in approximately 15 years, and who now have access to this space, which both serves them and connects them. Next. So all kinds of amazing things happen in the Bentway. I'm sure that most of you on the call from Toronto anyway, on this webinar will have had the opportunity to experience these things. These are one-of-a-kind things and also very ordinary daily life things. And so this no man's land, this former terra incognita, has become adhesive and inviting. Next. So one of the main activities is skating. It's a wintertime place. And so we created this 2.2 kilometer skating trail that weaves in and out of the columns under the Gardner. Next. And here's an image of it in use. It's very different from skating around in narrow circles in a typical rink. Next. And this is just hanging out at the Strawn Gate, where we took advantage of the fact that Strawn Avenue had to lift up over the Grand Trunk Railway, making it a kind of mezzanine level looking into the space. So this both hosts all kinds of special programs as an amphitheater, but also is just a place to gather. Next. Projecting forward, the skating trail is going to continue as is shown here, further west, right under Bathurst Street, linking to a new park called the Garrison Creek Park, the South Garrison Creek Park. So it will enable skating right over to, for those of you who know the area, right over to the Fort York Library. Next. What is most exciting for me as an urban designer is that when you do something like this, it sets off all these chain reactions and unexpected synergies. So at some point, quite a time ago, I identified some 16 things that probably would not have happened quite the way they did, but for the Bentway. Next. And now this idea of reinterpreting this found object, the elevated Gardner and the Lakeshore Corridor, the portion of it that you see running right across, about 3 kilometers across the Central Harbor, all the way from Exhibition Place over to the Don River has become a project of the City of Toronto, working with the mayor's office, with all the city departments, with a number of private actors, with the Waterfront BIA, with Waterfront Toronto, to take the spirit that the Bentway had engendered and apply that to a whole series of places across the waterfront. Next. And what it's producing in all of these neighborhoods is places that, but for the presence of this found structure, probably would not exist, and turning a barrier into a threshold. So I can make an analogy to Broadway cutting through the grid at an angle of New York City, and because of its angle, creating all these idiosyncrasies and all these found and special places. Next. So now I'm going to present something which is a bit of a cautionary tale or an unfinished tale, and this is protecting a vulnerable piece of mid-20th century legacy. Next, Ontario Place. So this is a sketch done by Eberhard Zeidler, one of our best known architects in the city, when he was called upon by the provincial government of the day to create something which was really inspired by Expo 67 in Montreal. And so he created this initial sketch, imagining this as a form of new urban parkland appended to the shoreline at Exhibition Place. Next. And so this great collaboration happened, Eberhard Zeidler's, who you've seen here, with this very precocious, technologically inspired architecture, which I refer to as the machine, collaborating with, next, Michael Huff, an equally prominent great landscape architect who unfortunately is no longer with us, but who was known for, among other things, the movement to bring back the Don River, a strong ecological bent to all of his work, and creating this garden setting for the work that Zeidler was doing. They worked together, and so I refer to this as the machine in the garden. Next. So this was, we have to keep reminding ourselves, a project of the same party that is in power currently at Queen's Park. So John Robarts, who was the Premier of Ontario at the time, spoke at a countdown reception, and this is a bit of his speech. In the end, it was opened by Bill Davis, who succeeded him as Premier, also a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. And you see this wonderful forum. Some of us who were around long enough may remember sitting on the grass watching these amazing performances at Ontario Place. Next. But here's the problem. Whereas we have a kind of inbuilt reverence for heritage of earlier periods, we are very prone to thinking about the more recent heritage, 20th century modernism, as something which doesn't have significant value. So after a very successful few years of operation, there followed a long period of wandering in the wilderness in terms of what Ontario Place should be. And I noted here some 20 reports that were done mostly by accounting firms that were looking at, for the government, what should they do with this? How could they monetize the assets? And really losing sight of what this had been about in the first place. In the middle of that, in red, I got involved in a study, and David Crombee on the call. David, you will remember, I was working for you as a representative at that time of the provincial government, and with Joe Pantaloni, who was the chair of the Exhibition Place board, on the idea of a merger of these two great sites side by side to create a great and very special public destination. Next. And so what emerged out of that idea was the coming together, the linking of these two sites over 300 acres, I think about 320 acres in total, into a great lakefront park, a 21st century park of a very special kind, which would have all kinds of events, sports events, cultural activities, things that were free to the public, as well as things that could charge admission, but a really extraordinary kind of park. And we came awfully close to making that happen. We got in front of provincial cabinet ministers, and somehow, for reasons that I can't spend the time going into, for what it simply fell apart. And so Ontario Place remained in jeopardy. Next. But the idea of at the time was that this consolidated lakefront park could extend, as I put it here, like an emerald arm across the entire waterfront, linking to the Martin Goodman Trail, to the Great Waterfront Trail, the Western Beaches, and what was happening in the heart of the city. Next. So, and this was a kind of image of that parkland stretching right across Lakeshore Boulevard, tying together the Central Waterfront and the Western Waterfront as an integrated band of parkland. Next. And if this would be done incrementally, piece by piece, with early win projects that could be identified. And next. And in fact, until recently, this is what was happening. So a provincial government recently began to implement this incremental vision with what is called Trillium Park and the William G. Davis Trail, named after Bill Davis, our former premier, which is a fantastic park, taking over a parking and servicing area at the eastern end of Ontario Place and reinterpreting this found 20th century Objets, Trouvees, this found place. Next. And so these are some images, and this has remarkable references to a much older history, the 12,000-year history of Indigenous occupation of these lands, which is of so much concern to us now these days, and rightfully so. And so with the involvement of the Mississaugas of the Credit, this wonderful moccasin definer that you see the kids climbing on, and a variety of things in this park recall that Indigenous presence as well. Next. And indeed, there was an extension of that idea going further to the west, which would more than double the size of Trillium Park, and would have carried this idea of a very sophisticated landscape reinterpretation of that landscape that Michael Huff had created, and extending right over to the architecture of Eberhard Zeidler, had this process continued. Next. But it was brutally interrupted when a cabinet minister of the current government went down on the site and came back saying the following: the current state of Ontario Place is disgraceful, and there's nothing that can be saved. We need to turn it into a world-class attraction. Nothing is off the table, and the site will become more of an amusement destination than a waterfront one. Now, obviously, this was a call to arms. Next. And so immediately, Ontario Place for All, which is a spin-off from Waterfront for All, was formed in defense of this mid-20th century wonderful legacy called Ontario Place. Ontario Place for All has been actively, in many ways, working to try and call attention to the value of this great resource and forestall its destruction. The government has made some steps, to be sure, at acknowledging some movement back in terms of saving some things. So everything is not on the table as was originally described, but much is still in jeopardy. And we've now been joined by the World Monuments Fund, by the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto, by the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, and many, many others. Next. Through Ontario Place for All, we commissioned a study from the New York firm HR&A, which specializes in looking at the economic value of public space, and proved, I think, by looking at many precedents, that even if all you cared about was the bottom line, remuneration, that in fact, Ontario Place is far more valuable to this region, to the province, to the city, to those of us who live here as a great public space than it is as a short-term monetization of the asset. Next. And so these are some recent images from this year of COVID. And if you were to go down there right now, as we're sitting here, I suspect you would see people doing what you see here, using this as a magnificent park on the waterfront and a place of highly desirable relief in these times. Next. And there is a competition which has been organized by the World Monuments Fund. I've been very privileged to be on the jury. I think you will be incredibly impressed when you see what the competitors came up with as an ideas competition for what could happen at Ontario Place as a way of demonstrating its potential. Next. And finally, I'm going to end with this. Here's another case of jeopardy. The Dominion Foundries, you've probably seen something about this in the news of late. This is a set of wonderful buildings created from 1917 to 1929. Again, a former waterfront site, now at some distance from the water's edge, but nonetheless, I think legitimately a waterfront site with heritage designations. You can see this wonderful interior used during the Pan Am Games. And suddenly on January 14th, a demolition crew showed up on the site sent by the provincial government and started to tear down these buildings. And the Friends of the Foundry was formed very quickly to come to its defense. So it's kind of a story like Ontario Place. Next. And so I worked with the Friends of the Foundry with some great colleagues, Shirley Blumberg at KPMG Architects, Joe Lodko from DETA, Luigi Ferrari from George Brown, Mark Guslitz and Sean Gatton, great housing experts, and we produced very quickly a demonstration of how a robust development program could be combined with preservation of these wonderful found objects from the Foundry, combining old and new and providing, as you see here, great public spaces at Foundry Square and Foundry Lane. Next. And this is my final image and final point. This transformation of the waterfront is a huge multi-generational undertaking. It involves hundreds of actors. It transforms single political administrations. And to be successful, as this collage demonstrates, it requires very strong ongoing community stewardship, including an eye, as in the case of the Foundry or Ontario Place or the other examples that I've shown you, with an eye to the natural and built heritage. And this is really stressing the importance of an organization like Waterfront for All. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much, Ken. A really wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. So we're going to start off our questions with a couple from Waterfront for All. So I'll just dive in. You know, Ken, you mentioned, and it was great that it was cool that you cited Marcel Duchamp, but when you said something, you know, it's like, it reminded me of something they say about photography, right? You can have the fancy camera, you can have the fancy lenses, but the trick is to see it. Mm-hmm. Can you cite an example of like how you found it helpful, or what happened when people, like, what was the, I guess, you know, what was the key thing that, examples of key things where people were able to see something that hadn't been seen? Like, how did that come about, or what was the trigger for that? Because
in that particular case, and I'll just use that as an example, I often describe this as an aha moment. When something you're so used to looking at in a certain way, you imagine it as something else. So that's the Masaduchon moment. The next thing is to show other people what you've seen. And that was the role of working with my colleagues at Public Work and lifting the lid off the highway, because people were so used to being offended by that highway coming across the city. Every description you would ever hear of it was an ugly intrusion. And so we began to speak of what we called the strange beauty of the Gardner, which really was odd for people to hear at first. But when we started to show it, it actually, as in the case of Will and Judy Matthews, and then the mayor and the two councillors and a whole bunch of other people, it became a reality. So let me mention a couple of things I didn't talk about in the talk, but my wife Etty will be grateful for me mentioning these because she's very fond of them. And those are the two silos that we have managed to save, which bookend this stretch of Queens Quay. So the Canada Malting and Victory Soya Mill are sitting there waiting to be reinterpreted into something very special and very interesting. And when you start to look at the world this way, and Ton is going to show us a bunch of things in Amsterdam that have a similar capacity, and you open your eyes to the possibility that things may be other than what you have always thought of them as, that's when the magic happens.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. Ed Hoare, do you have a question? Our esteemed chair of Waterfront for All?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ken, we've got a big airport down there on the island. It's 200 plus acres on the island. It's now connected by a tunnel to the eastern, to the western gap. I'm wondering if you've, and we don't know the fate of it, but we do know that the lease that governs it expires in 2033, not so long from now. And I wonder if you've let your imagination range around the idea of that airport as a found object and what perhaps it might one day be turned into.
Yeah, I'll answer that in a couple of ways, Ed. First of all, I'm certainly not the only one to imagine that the airport ceases to exist. We have examples in other cities, Hong Kong being one, Chicago being another, where those airports right in the heart of the city have been decommissioned for a variety of reasons. No Jets has long called attention to the noise problems, the environmental problems, the new safety measures that would call for the runways to be expanded. So there are any number of reasons why at some point in time it might cease to exist. So the second part of my answer would be, when and if that happens, there are actually some interesting structures on the site, which, and the first knee-jerk reaction might be make tabula rasa of it and start all over again and do something completely different. A second answer might be, if that became, let's call it parkland or more public space, could there be a new life for some of those structures? And I'll give you another example of an airport that has been decommissioned, which is Downsview. And Downsview had all those extraordinary hangars where Bombardier was making planes and then testing them on the runway. I'm actually acting as an advisor to the group that is redeveloping the Downsview Airport. And indeed, we are looking at a reinterpretation of the runway. And I don't want to give too much away, but as a spine of public space in a new form, but also adaptive reuse of the hangars. So I think when you look at the world that way, there are always really interesting potential to be unlocked.
Ken, I have some questions. One question I have is, if someone wanted a little more clarity on the Bentway, what's the public-private relationship in terms of who pays for capital costs, operating and governance, and how and where the burden of responsibility is?
So there was, well, let me speak to the governance first. The Bentway has been set up as a conservancy. This was actually modeled on the Central Park Conservancy in New York, Prospect Park Conservancy, Battery Park Conservancy. There are a number of them. And it is an arm's length organization separate from city government, but with two city councilors serving on the board, reporting to the city. Much of it is on public land. Some of it will be on easements on private land. And it initial capital investment, an investment of $25 million came from the Matthews. The city has contributed an amount toward programming, operation, and maintenance, but the Conservancy is raising a lot more of that budget from some combination of philanthropy and sponsorships. And so the operating budget is a combination of a variety of sources. As this goes forward and it extends across the harbor, the capital investment will come from a variety of sources, some public, some private, over time, as well as the operating budget.
Thank you, Ken. And another question is, can you identify objects, other objects for that aha moment on the waterfront that you haven't mentioned already? Is there anything that occurs to you?
You know, I think as we, well, here's a huge one that, again, I'm not by no means the first to think about it. The Hearn generating plant is 2.5 times the size of the Tate Modern, which has been reinterpreted as this great art space. The interiors, for those who have not been inside, it was open to the public during Luminato at one point, and you could see the unbelievable potential that it had at that point. Broadview Avenue is now in the plans for the Portlands being extended right down to the Hearn. There actually is, interestingly enough, and this was something that people have speculated on, there's a rail spur that goes right from the Hearn and makes its way back to Union Station. And so the idea of, and I don't even know if this is still possible, at one time it would have been possible to have some kind of special shuttle that would have gotten you out to that area around Cherry Beach and the Hearn. So there just are so many things on the ground. In that area of the Portlands, there are any number of warehouse structures. So the plan for Villiers Island, for example, has identified a lot of those heritage structures, which would have been the equivalent of the foundry that I showed you, that are now being slated for preservation and for adaptive reuse. And Jane Jacobs made the wonderful point in Death and Life, written in 1961, that having this combination of old and new structures simply enables things to happen that otherwise would not happen, would not be possible. Both in terms of the cultural memories they embody, the kinds of space they provide, this connecting us to a continuum of the society we live in. Think of the distillery district, and imagine that all those distillery buildings had been wiped out. What a different place it would be. So I would say, to answer your question, Ed, whenever I have a new project, wherever it is never really a tabula rasa. There's always something there to be reinterpreted.
Thanks, Ken. Well, I think we have 3 more questions, and that will conclude our questions. So these have all come from a variety of people in the Zoom chat. Someone said there's always lots of people for something and lots of people against. How do you navigate incremental progress given the often fraught nature of our conversations about urban revitalization and redevelopment?
I think it's a matter of continued involvement and collective memory. And that's why on the final slide that you see up on the screen, I stress that aspect of community stewardship. I'll give you another example, which is far from our waterfront, about which there is disagreement now. And this is something that David Crombee is very involved in. So I'm bringing this up deliberately, but it comes to mind, and that is the Greenbelt. And the Greenbelt is a treasure. it is probably one of, if not the largest legislated such green protected area around the major city. And yet we now have a government in power that doesn't seem to recognize its value and has been making all kinds of moves to weaken the role of the conservation authorities that protect it, to allow through ministerial zoning orders, intrusions into the greenway, even to the point of planning to build a major new provincial highway right through the greenway. And so the only way to deal with things like that is through people power. I'll call it that, through stewardship, through people being mobilized and people who have a longer view than the next election and who will be there no matter who comes to power to continue to articulate and advocate for those things we value.
Well, that ties in really nicely as a segue to our last question that we have time for. And it was, these are actually a couple of questions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to combine them. So one of the sort of part A was how do you best communicate and champion a vision and new ideas for Ontario Place if you were not eligible to participate in the future of the Ontario Place Design Challenge and call for counterproposals. So I guess if you're an ordinary citizen who is in an architecture firm, you know, what would be a way you could help champion a new vision for Ontario Place? And in such a new vision, so part two, is there a need for residential on or near the site to make it truly viable?
So the answer to the first part is in all these situations, the Foundry, Ontario Place for All has a website. Friends of the Foundry have a website. Just go on the website and there are umpteen ways people can get involved. In the case of the Foundry, as of a couple of weeks ago, 23,000 people had signed the petition. There was a deluge of letters to Steve Clark, the minister, and to the premier, and to the point where we were summoned to a meeting by assistant deputy ministers from a number of ministries and senior officials from Infrastructure Ontario because it was impossible to ignore. The same thing is happening with Ontario Place for All. To the second part of the question, I think it's really important not just to say no, but to be clear about what you say yes to. So in the visioning for Ontario Place, if you combine Ontario Place with Exhibition Place, and you look at the fact that a new station, a multimodal station, is being built for the GO line at Exhibition Place and Liberty Village to be combined with a station for the new Ontario line, combined with the 509 LRT line, and a shuttle which will go throughout the combined Exhibition Place, Ontario Place site, there is a great argument for residential not sitting in Ontario Place, but actually on the northern boundary of Exhibition Place. So by changing the terms of reference, by changing the size of the site you're looking at, you can provide needed residential. You can also provide a great source of revenue by using that land asset that could go to funding some of the improvements for the combined site. So it's an example of not necessarily accepting the boundaries in which a problem is set, but questioning those boundaries.
Ken, thank you so much. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions. If people want to submit questions in the chat, we can collect them and see if we can get it. We'll endeavor to get answers back to you and post them on our website, potentially, depending on the volume, we may be able to respond directly to you via email if you wish to provide your email address in the chat along with your question. So why don't we just take, if anyone needs to stretch, look around the room, why don't we take 2 minutes? It's 3:03 Eastern Standard Time, and we'll take 2 minutes and then we'll come back with Ton's presentation. And one thing I do want to mention, a shameless plug while we're stretching. is Waterfront for All is, as Ed said, a group that is all volunteers. It relies on energy and sweat equity from our volunteer base, and we are planning on keeping the speaker series going roughly every 2 months through the course of the year. We look forward to the day we can return to in-person and/or hybrid online and in-person events. And one thing that can help us is if anyone, obviously many people are facing financial hardship during the pandemic. We completely understand that. But if anyone is able to consider supporting us, one thing you can do is go to our waterfrontforall.ca website, check out what's there, and also go to the donate window and make a small donation. So I'm just going to stretch myself. I'm going to take my own advice, and we'll be back in approximately a minute with Ton. Thank you. Ton, it's a pleasure to have you with us from Amsterdam. Are you on? There we are.
Yeah,
How are you?
I'm well.
Good.
It's in the evening now. It's 9 o'clock here.
Yeah.
Dark, raining.
Well, we appreciate you being with us. And with no further ado, I'd ask you to let's dive right into your presentation.
Yes, okay, I will do that. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to think about what I've been doing in the last 20, 30 years. I started this slide where you can see all these different columns. Do the next one, please. That's the inside of this little church, we call it now. 5th century it was built. Next. And this is the interior they created with reusing these old Roman columns, most of them different from each other, different heights, different capitals. And this we would now call a church. And of course, it's a very, very early example of found object. Found objects is not something that we invented. Next, please. It's him again. Here he sits in an exhibition in Germany in the 1950s or 60s, I suppose. There, his fountain is again being exhibited. Perhaps he's already a little bit tired of the whole circus, but he was the guy who invented it again in the 1970s. So at the same time as Mondrian and Picasso invented modernism, one could say, he invented a total different approach. Not form follows function, but forms can have all kinds of meanings and also all kinds of functions. Next, please. And here you see Amsterdam is a matter of pumping water all the time. The little slide shows two pumping stations next to each other. The white one is the newer one. And here the left slide shows the interior of the left older one that is kept as a reserve, because if the new one has to be replaced, then the old one has to function once again. And in the meantime, this is a concert venue. At the moment, of course, it's COVID time, so the grand piano is covered with a black blanket, but the pump is still there and can work any moment. Next, please. And this is Amsterdam. It is much smaller than Toronto, and it is 600 kilometers more north. The entry to the sea is on the left-hand side of the slide, and right used to be the entry to the sea before the canal was dug. You see the old town in the middle, this half moon, more or less, which is a UNESCO heritage site. And you see that dynamics in construction are in a kind of ring, a kind of coral reef around this old part of town. The green parts is in fact all agricultural. It's all meadows, most of them is meadows, and a few parks. And it's all a former marsh. There's water everywhere. 1 meter below level, there's also water. You see the airport at the left-hand side. Next, please. And of course, part of this dynamic zone is also the new central business district on the south side of the city. I won't be talking about this. This is high density, close to a public transport node, and it's under construction, as you can see. Next, please. This is more interesting for our story today. You see here building fragments from the 11th century to yesterday. The boardwalk in front of the slide is recently has been constructed. It's part of a new meaning the waterfront has gotten in Amsterdam. Next, please. The old part itself is handled with much care. As you can see, the new infills are very carefully designed. They are limited in height. There's a constant maintenance of the division between land and water. And of course, it's also a very big tourist attraction, please. And here you see two examples by one architect, Stephen Hall, who took a few parts away from a building and also added a new extension to a 19th century building on the edge of the old town. These are all these Duchamp moments that you think suddenly he was surprised with the idea by the monuments department that the building on the left-hand side was also a monument. So he said, well, I will keep it. And I will make the most monumental aspects of this building visible by taking some of the brickwork away. Next. And here we did it in a new neighborhood on the east side of town, on a former sewage plant, where one of the stations of this, one of the machineries of this plant was kept as a cafe, and also, of course, influenced the layout of the whole neighborhood. Next. I will be talking for the rest of this about the waterfront. You see it in more detail from the left where the harbor is at the North Sea side, to the east on the right-hand side where Eiburg is, newly created land of the last 20 years. Next. And here you see a comparison of this waterfront part of town with Toronto. I found in an old book that I have, Towards a New Toronto Utopia, an interesting proposal to redesign the city airport into a housing neighborhood where they left open the landing strips and filled in the rest with houses. A funny proposal that is exactly the opposite with what we did in the Eastern Docklands. Next, please. Where the strips, the harbor strips were built over, and where this moment of 1987 was perhaps my Duchamp moment, when I realized that we didn't have to change the whole form of this former harbor, this obsolete harbor, but we could simply consider it a found object. I call it here the Mikado Principe. And well, you know the game of Mikado, you take these sticks out very carefully. And that's what we did. We took the sticks out very carefully. They all had their own numbers and colors, and they would have their own types of urban design and their own architects and their own atmosphere, but they would be entire elements forming together this new neighborhood. Next. This strategy of working island for island was later exported to the west part of the waterfront and also to the north side. You see the north side a little bit different from the south with the green shoreline. All shores have been made public, accessible for everybody. That's the good thing about the name of your organization. The waterfront is for all. That's what the city council always has said, and what we have, well, very been honored to make possible. Yes. Not only the fixed elements, the quay walls, the water basins, the land, but also the boats, the floating elements that used to go to Germany and are now too small for present day traffic. They are, of course, very good houseboats, and houseboat is a very popular way of living in Amsterdam. Next. Here you see one of the islands where older and newer buildings are combined into a kind of new entity. Next. Here you see it in an old photograph from the air. The older buildings, the smaller ones, the quay walls, the houseboats arranged on the waterfront in a new way. And also this Mikado idea of the different directions of the different piers that work together to form new spaces. Next. Here you see the connecting dam from the north to the south. Next. And here this combination of former harbor, now used for smaller boats and for houseboats, new buildings, old buildings, all together. Yes, next. Creating an atmosphere that people like, because that's what I can conclude after 20 years, that people like to live here. Next. Old buildings on old materials, the reuse, it's now very hip to recycle materials, but this was done in the 1990s, beginning of the 1990s. Next, please. New neighborhood park, older buildings, newer buildings, few lines to the surroundings. Next. Even trees from the harbor history of the whole area have been kept. As long as they want to live, they will be able to stay here. Next. And then the view over one of the water basins, right, an older building from the 1900s, left a new one. Yes, next. And even the quay wall has not been taken away, but is part of the new park, neighborhood park that is in the center of these two peninsulas. Next. And then on the other side, the older warehouses, you see them, have been renovated, residential and working space on top of them, making it into a new border of the water. Yes, please. A mix of the different categories, the different people that live in Amsterdam. Many people from all over Europe, from all over the world, even, and from all over Holland. There are many students. There's 2 universities. And all these people together, they are Amsterdammers, and that's what we want to accommodate. And in order to do that, the policy, the city policy is very much one of mixing. So in this row of apartment buildings you see here on the right-hand side, all kinds of, there's student housing, that's with the heavy colors. There's empty nesters apartments. There are apartments for families with children, and they are all mixed in a very equal way. And on the outside, you cannot guess whether it's expensive or whether it's very affordable. And in the middle of it, there's the public space. That's the most important part, where everything mixes. And this one, this black asphalt, is the spine of this island, Java Island. It's a bike path. Next, please. Of course, you can put in the heavy guns for creating possibilities for people to meet, like this skate park here on one of the islands on the east. Next. Even in COVID times, she is working and she is playing with her child at the same time, as many parents do. And what is also very important, that this public space really connects well to all destinies. And even all houses, private houses, many people don't have gardens. So the wide sidewalks is one of the most important decisions we took already 30 years ago. Next. And reintroducing also in the Amsterdam urbanism, the privately developed, privately commissioned house. These houses even have two entries, one on the water side and one on the street that's behind these row of houses. Next. A few slides about the former timber dock. This is how it looked in 1910. A wood harbor, an existing workers' neighborhood that was at the time very new. And the people who lived there were the people I talked to when we made the plan. Of course, they wanted a better relation to the waterfront. So that became a guiding principle for the design of this urban plan. The dike that connects these houses and that protects the south of Amsterdam against the water of the IJ estuary was at the moment when we started planning a very busy car road. So we had to do something about that. Next. Here you see the scheme we developed together with the people living in the existing neighborhood. We opened up the canals, we elongated them until the dike. We put the car road under level and below grade. You can hardly see it on the drawing, but you will probably believe me. Next. All these new piers all have different widths, because that was one of the lessons of the found objects on the east side of the waterfront, that the width of the pier was very decisive for the kind of houses and the kind of atmosphere you could create. So we were looking for variations, and we created a meeting point between the old neighborhood and the new one, exactly in the middle of this slide, the green neighborhood park. Next. Here you see it. The houses on the left-hand side have been more or less renovated, most of them. But the people whom I talked to are still living there. On the right-hand side, you see a kind of picture of the whole development. Next. And then, of course, this is the proof of the pudding. Do they live together in a nice way? Well, you have to judge for yourself. Next, please. They are not talking, but they're sitting on the same bench. Next. Yeah. By doing this, by creating these new neighborhoods along the waterfront, turning flat quays into built-up city, the whole identity of the IJ also changed from a water that was the border of town into a water that is like the Canal Grande in Venice, in the center of town. And the building of the film museum was a decisive step in this. You can see it on the next slide. A public function that also attracts people not living in North, but also in South, people from everywhere. And suddenly that was a big step for Amsterdam, that Amsterdam North was no longer a part of the city far away, but it was a part of Amsterdam. Next. Of course, it's also about the cafe. All museums are about the cafe. Next. And film museums also at night, of course. Next. At the same time, a new metro line was constructed between north and south. Yeah, next. But the main thing in Amsterdam, of course, is the bike. So the whole system only works because the combination of bike traffic and public transport is the spine of transport in Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam North, all kinds of different developments you can see there, because it is the structure of Amsterdam North is more like a patchwork. So the freedom to organize things is even bigger than on the south side of the waterfront. Here is a development in the time that was considered a crisis. Some 12 years ago, there was a real estate crisis. Only individuals were asking the city for possibilities to build their home. And here you see a project that came out of this. Next. It's not only about one family houses, it's also about apartments, looking like a house from the outside, but being apartments. You can see it here from the letterboxes. Next. And this is a kind of an American import because we have made here a back lane that gives houses an extra entrance and an extra possibility for a room or a workspace close to house. Next. Directly from the United States or from Canada, I suppose. Next. And of course, the secret of the Amsterdam transportation system, the bakfiets. Next. Yes, this is the block from the other side. The small houses in the middle and the bigger ones on the street side. Next. Living on water is very popular, as I said, and this is one of the views you can have if you bike through Amsterdam North. Next. And have a view back to the old town on the south side of A. Next. Creating bike bridges and pedestrian bridges is in fact enough. Of course, we do make all developments accessible for cars, but the car is really not dominant. And the dominant features are the routes like this, bridges and cycle paths, because that's the main traffic in the city of Amsterdam. Here, one of the former shipyards, and that's the Jane Jacobs argument Ken was talking about. They attract things and activities and people that would never be attracted to a place in a new neighborhood. This is, you can see it here and you can see it on this slide. All kinds of activities are taking place here, and it's all the arguments Ken mentioned. But at the same time, it's the other argument. They are only worth what you need to keep them fit, these buildings, because they have been they have been used and they have been written off, and now they are starting a totally new life. Next. Always, of course, the contact with the river and the views back to the town. Yes. As you can see here. Next. Yeah, I have a few slides about developments on the east side where the city created land itself. The abundance of space Canada has is of course exactly the opposite of the lack of space we have in Holland. And Amsterdam chose to create a total new development some 30 years ago via a referendum. And here you see the pilot island, where the methods of land making and planting were tested before they were implemented in Eiburg as a whole. Next, please. Here you see the development, well, some 20 years ago. And here, of course, we had to work without found objects, apart from what was found in the sand that was taken from the sea bottom. So we created a kind of time lapses. We created a kind of urbanism where there is a difference between the bigger thing and the smaller development. and that can adapt to developments in the real estate market, in the population, what people want. And also, of course, what we have at the moment is all these things with circularity and building in wood and a building without the use of energy and CO2 emissions. That can all be implemented because this is a very robust frame, 2 frames, in fact, a water frame and a street frame laid over each other. And here you see it under construction some 20 years ago. Next, please. The entrance from city side, yes, next. And the latest island, Centrum Eiland, which was also started in the moment that the real estate market was very low, and only private individuals were able to finance new construction. So you can see a lot of private houses and a few apartment buildings, all built by people in the city looking for new, wider horizons. Next. This is how it will look in a few years. And as we speak, on the right-hand side is the last phase of Eiburg. In the meantime, it's under construction. Next. Yes, the last slides are about, well, the transport system. I told something about it already. This whole thing started in the 1970s with big riots by the population of the city, because the city planners had, just like Robert Moses had in New York, planned to make big thoroughfares for car traffic through the city. There was even an American expert, David Keenan, who had a big plan for Amsterdam with all kinds of 6-7 lane roads encircling the old town. Well, there was a real uprise under the population, and there was a total new generation of politicians came into power, and they decided to stop this whole thing. And so since the 1980s, we are building this kind of city that is walkable and bikeable, and that is accessible for cars, but not too many cars and not all at the same time. So we can keep the fine-grained structure of the city that is much liked by the people who live there, and many people who would like to live there. And that helps us very much to do this. Next. So this is the result. Of course, this is a temporary bike shed near to the central station. The new one will be built under the water basin in the middle of the slide, and will have a capacity for 10,000 bikes close to central station. Next. But also in new developments along the ring that I showed earlier. Well, here you can see Station Rai. It's a train station that is directly adjacent to a bike park of 2,000 bikes. Next. And then, of course, this whole bike system has to be completed into a new ring. Amsterdam is always thinking in rings. And this one is called the Binnenring, the inner ring, and it will be a bike ring. 2 bridges will be constructed over the Ij, only for bikes. And you can see one of them in the next slide. Close to this timber dock neighborhood that is under construction, almost finished. There will be the western part of this ring, and the whole Ij river, or it is in fact an estuary. The whole estuary is still a very busy transport route from the North Sea to Germany. So we have to take into account all these kind of movements that must be necessary and must also be safely necessary. Next. Well, this is how the map of the water part of Amsterdam, the northern part of Amsterdam, will look like after completing these 2 bridges. Yes, next please. And then, of course, after the bridges have been completed, these ferries will be found objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ton. Wonderful presentation. I feel like we've just been to Amsterdam. That was lovely. Thank you. And and of course, unfortunately, we can't really jump on a plane and fly over to see you right now, but hopefully we will be in the not so very distant future. So what you I mean, it was interesting talking about that because you may know the story in Toronto. There was a proposal to build the Spadina Expressway right through what have become both extraordinarily expensive in some cases, but also very prized neighborhoods in downtown in the 70s. And that was successfully stopped. And Jane Jacobs was a big part of that as well, as many others, and David Crombee and other people. But I was thinking in terms of, can you say something about the political and social support for mixed income neighborhoods in Amsterdam? Is that something that had to be sort of fought for, or is that, over time?
No, that's in fact, it has never been really discussed. Of course, the real estate market developments, they always tend to select some neighborhoods that do better than others, and then of course people who have money tend to go there. So there are these tendencies for segregation. Segregation is much discussed at the moment in Amsterdam, but in new developments, the city council. And that's perhaps an important thing that I have not mentioned yet. The city council is the owner of much of the land in Amsterdam. So the city council can really put its agenda on developments. Wherever in Amsterdam the city council has this power. And then, there's a lot of discussion. Should it be 30% affordable or 40% affordable? Should it be 30% middle income or 40% middle income? It's always 20% very expensive, and this division is created in every new project. Even in the central business district near the Station Zuid, we are introducing affordable housing now in towers and in other blocks until we have 40% of all the residential units to be affordable.
Oh, thank you. Ed, our esteemed chair, Ed Hoare, do you have a question for Ton? We're going to have to unmute you.
There I am. I'm unmuted.
There you are.
Thanks, Ton. I enjoyed that very much. I have been to Amsterdam, and I loved it. And of course, I love partly that there's water and canals everywhere. The interesting thing about Toronto, as you may know, is that we have a kind of a canal as well. It's just that nobody can really get near it. We call it the ship channel. It's about a mile long. It's in the Portlands. And some of the land near it, and it has this in common with the airport, is kind of reserved for shipping, even though we don't have really that much shipping. We're not a very busy port here. We're one of the least busy ports in Canada. And so that's a bit of a paradox, but we have a lot of land that's kind of reserved for shipping and that you really cannot get very close to with this agency kind of presiding over it that has it for legacy reasons. And my question, I guess, is presumably something of the similar sort existed in Amsterdam. You had large areas devoted to, say, shipping or storage of shipping related material or cranes or whatever for industrial purposes. But they eventually left and things were repurposed for other things. They became more accessible to people to either live there or work there or just walk around. And I'm wondering, did that happen by itself, or was it necessary in Amsterdam to push some of these legacy owners out, or how did that process unfold?
Yeah, that was a very slow process, and it needs, it's also just like Ken said in the other lecture, it needs long-term commitment. And it needs strong politicians, of course, who have a very clear political agenda. The need for housing in Amsterdam is always big. I have not known any time that there was not a big need for houses in Amsterdam. Even we built, let's say, about between 5,000 to 10,000 units per year since the war. So that's 60 or 70 years. So we have built half a city in the existing city. Still, there's a need for housing. So every politician knows that the breadth of the people is in his neck. And there are big fights between the housing department and the economic department that's defending interests of the big companies and the harbor companies. So, for example, this timber dock was quite a big fight. Even the Prime Minister of Holland, I have shown around. We have been sitting in a boat on this timber dock, and then I asked the captain to put out the motor so we could hear the noise of the industrial companies, and we didn't hear anything. So I said to him, "Well, we can build houses here," and still he doubted whether this was a good idea. So this is just as it is in Canada. It is a difficult thing in Holland. But the big difference, of course, is that we don't have many choices. We don't have many opportunities. So I think Amsterdam will build a new harbor more to the west, closer to the sea, and that this timber dock will have that. I don't think that, but that's a fact. It has already been approved by the city council by a next phase of housing, moving to further to the west and pushing the harbor out more west even than it is at the moment.
Thank you, Ton. I've got some questions from the chat. One question we had was asking about infrastructure in terms of retail, grocery stores, restaurants, pharmacies. I know you showed that beautiful cafe in the museum, but they're wondering about that. I think there was also a question about parking, but I think you answered that in your slides. It was an early question. I think we saw where the parking access was in some of the housing developments. But yeah, so where are the shops, pharmacies, restaurants?
Yeah, well, that's a very controlled business in Amsterdam. There is a shop planning committee that decides where shops are allowed and where not. That is, of course, to protect existing shops. So every development has its shops and also its restaurants. But for example, sometimes it doesn't go as you would like to. For example, the north side of Java Island, I would like to have shops and cafes there on all corners. But that didn't work because, well, there were people opposed to it and the city planning committee had a say in it. And then I lost the battle. It's yeah, some battles you lose and some you win. But in general, every development has its shops and all on a walking distance. That's of course the thing. It is really not, we don't have big mega malls alongside big roads full of car traffic. We have one of them on the east side of Amsterdam, but the rest of Amsterdam shops while biking through the city, and on the way they see the butcher and the baker and the supermarket.
Thank you. Another question, I think you sort of answered that, but there was another question about the mix. We've got a couple of questions that involve the mix of housing types, and you said that talked about the debate between should be 30% affordable, deeply affordable, or 30% middle income. So there's a question about how that gets done. Is it mandated, specifically mandated by the city council, and what's the role of private developers and how that gets delivered?
Well, because the city is the landowner, the city can decide whom to lease the land to. So the city is a kind of divide and rule principle. So they have many people and many parties to talk to. And they make divisions, well, from one project to another project, but the number of units is decided by the city council. The density and the number of, well, expensive, middle income, affordable is a political decision. In fact, as the ground, the land ownership is concerned, Amsterdam is a kind of communist state.
And so just to clarify, another question was asking to clarify. So in the new neighborhoods, in the repurposed neighborhoods, in the old industrial parts of the port that have been repurposed for residential and urban living, and in the new island that's being built, the islands that are being built, is it correct to say that those are all those neighborhoods have multi demographics in them? That there is a mix of the mix of housing types and affordability levels are included in all those neighborhoods?
Absolutely, yes. And it's also been their colleagues of mine are investigating the results. For example, Eiburg has more or less the same population as Amsterdam as a whole has. In terms of income, in terms of immigration backgrounds, and in terms of even of households. Only what you can say is in the newer neighborhoods where the houses are bigger, there are more families with children.
Right. And can you speak a bit more about the sort of how both public investment and private investment, how private capital and public capital have been working together in the redevelopment of the harbor?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. I could talk for hours about it because it's full of juicy details. But it's changing all the time. So after every development, the city council says, oh, we are never going to talk to them again. And then they're talking to somebody else. And then after 5 years, they say, oh, no, not them again. So it is a constant kind of mating process between city and private capital. For example, Eiburg was, I have been working for a private consortium there that leased all the land of the biggest island, Haven Island, before the referendum was even made. And then they had a land lease contract, and they had a contract to build 8,000 units before then and then. Because the city was afraid that the opponents against Eiburg, there were also a lot of opponents, well, they would win the whole debate by saying nobody wants to live there, nobody wants to build there. So the alderman, well, he took the decision to sell the land beforehand. So he said to everybody, well, the land is already sold, we just have to make it. And then, of course, after this process, everybody said, well, this is a process that we are never going to repeat again. And so it goes on and on.
So I was interested, that ties into a question. We got a question that actually you've partially answered it already. It's talking about how citizen groups organize to fight or debate or engage with private developers. And how the city council and the public sector support or do not support citizens in terms of that kind of engagement. Specifically thinking now in Toronto, we do have, as you know, we have the Waterfront Toronto process, which has tried to do and largely succeeded in many areas to do the planning up front, precinct planning, and to define what the expectations are in terms of affordable housing and park space and public realm. But much of our development in Toronto is one-off projects, with private capital. And there is a sense that many people have in Toronto that we sort of have to fight to get appropriate public benefits from each and every single development. So can you speak to that a little bit more to that, how that works out in Amsterdam and in your experience?
Yeah, well, I've been talking, of course, a lot to people that lived for every development. You talk to the people who live there already in squatters or people living in houseboats. They were already there before I came. So we negotiated about parking places, about how high the buildings would be, about how public it is it accessible at night, etc., etc. Also the connections to sewer and to power and to that kind of thing. Also the houseboats are all connected to the sewer system in Amsterdam. So that is that's something that needs a lot of negotiation. That, in my experience, goes very well. Everybody has the same interest. It must be a nice neighborhood after it's finished, and we can endure some troubles during construction, but afterwards it should be nice. More difficult is, of course, for bigger parties, bigger real estate parties to come in. But there, the city always has this powerful position of being the landowner. The difference, for example, one of the more difficult things in my professional life was to talk to German investors who had big office blocks in the Zuidas, which is the new central business district. And they sit in Hamburg. They have a portfolio that goes from Dublin to Warsaw. And they say, well, Amsterdam is a very small part of our portfolio, and we've always complaints because these buildings have very nasty plinths. The downside looks very awful after 6 o'clock. So I thought, well, I'm going to phone these people and ask them whether they can do something about it. Well, then the position of the city is not very strong. German people tend to try to obey officials from cities. That's the only thing I have then, and that's not very much, in fact.
Interesting. So it's not conflict free.
No, no. It keeps a lot of people off the street.
So Well, I got a question. You mentioned the ferries. Has anyone thought about what you're going to do with those ferries when they're no longer in use?
No, you can buy them, I suppose. My first project in Amsterdam was the Waterloo Plein, which is a flea market. And the stones I used then, I put a pavement of brick in. That was the first brick in Amsterdam after the Second World War. And they have recently been sold to a smaller city in the south of Holland, because Amsterdamers like very much negotiating and being commercial and selling and buying things. So I suppose if you're the first customer, you have a real serious opportunity. They have some 20 of these things.
Right. Interesting. I wonder if we have any buyers. Ed, do you think we should, I'm going to say, Ed Horst, should we start a fundraising campaign, a GoFundMe campaign to buy a Waterfront for All ferry from Amsterdam?
Sounds good.
Um,
I have a question that's a little dear to my heart. May not interest other people. That's unfortunate, I guess. But I'm a paddler. One of the things I really enjoyed doing in Amsterdam was paddling around the canals. I found somebody who would rent me a boat, and I was able to go into the concentric circle canals and paddle around and up and down the Amstel River. I don't know if I got out into the eye, but I got out sort of that way a bit. And it seemed to me, and I know there's a lot of tour boats and so on, but it seemed to me to be in a lot of ways an ideal city for personal, smaller craft like that. Canoes, kayaks, maybe little sailboats and things. And I'm wondering, now we've had something of an issue here about storage and access to the water for that sort of activity. And I wonder if that goes on in Amsterdam, and if so, how you've responded to it.
Yeah, it's you're very right. It's the small boats are have a very good opportunity here. Supping is now also standing on a kind of surf plank. And,
yeah, that's a new thing. Yeah,
they do it in front of my house and through the whole city. And of course, we also have conflicts here, because when it becomes unsafe, then the harbor authority becomes dangerous for accidents, because one accident is enough to bring a lot of publicity, of course. So there are these kind of territorial fights between the harbor authority and neighborhoods. For example, I live on one of these islands in the east side of the waterfront. We have a little boardwalk where we swim in the eye, which is forbidden officially. So the city has put a thing on, and then our neighborhood has painted it white, and they have put on a new text, and that says "swim at your own risk." And well, that kind of thing happened. That is the Dutch situation, and probably not far away from the Canadian situation.
Right.
We respect each other, but we also are a little bit a bureaucrat in the deep inside of us. Is this bureaucrat?
Well, Ton, we're going to get close to wrapping things up, because I'm mindful of the fact, Ton, that it is getting close to 10 p.m. Central European Time. So if you could indulge us, I've just got a couple of more questions, and those will be our final questions. To what extent do you think the bike-centric nature of Amsterdam informs the built form and scale, and as opposed to a city like Toronto, despite recent efforts to make it more bike-friendly, is still very much a car and to some extent subway city. So how important is the bike network, bike centricness of the city to the emerging built form?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. The city could not function on cars alone. We have a car, but we have 4 bikes here in the garage, and we live with the 2 of us in this house. So without a bike, Amsterdam is uninhabitable. So it's totally different from Rotterdam already. In Rotterdam, you can use your car almost for everything. Even going out by car is a possibility there. Of course, it's not really sensible, but it happens. Here, it is this total bike orientation. The streets are simply too narrow to accommodate all cars that would want to drive there. And they started with a very heavy taxing of parking places in the 1980s. that went on, and now we have the most expensive parking places in Europe. But there's no alternative, because you would have to tear down 3/4 of the city if you would want to allow all the cars.
Another question is, to what extent is residential mixed in with I know you mentioned the central business district.
Yeah.
Is there residential infill in there? I mean, our financial district was pretty much a ghost town after the banks, bank workers went home. A little bit less so now. I mean, now, I don't mean, I say now, I mean recent pre-pandemic, but still, pretty much focused on, in the core financial district is pretty much offices. There are, what's the situation?
We try to mix. We would like to mix more than really happens, and the mixing in fact goes best in areas that have been office areas and that are now, well, more or less derelict or obsolete, and then suddenly a residential moves in. So that in that way, mixing is much more successful than the other way around. If you build residential and ask office developers to build there, because they don't want to. They all want to put their buildings where all the other office buildings are. And that really is not very smoothly. I've missed a few points there in my own experience.
Okay, our final question, Ton, if you were going to, for that very, 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 high value contract we're obviously going to offer you, if you were going to tell Toronto, if there was one message you were going to give Toronto in terms of our future, especially with the waterfront focus, is there something you would tell us to focus on or not to miss?
No, I don't think so. I think you're doing a very good job. I was amazed by Ken's project under the highway. I've seen this highway some 12 years ago, and I thought, well, take it away, but it's not necessary. It's very good. So I think you're doing very well. I have some 12 years ago also, I've said to an audience in I think it was in the City Hall, in this beautiful oyster-like room. So take these little islands away, so that your big city is sitting on a big lake, and that not these stupid little islands are in between. But they didn't like this remark at all. So I think you're doing very well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone who attended. Again, if you're listening to this and you have a chance to support our work and help us carry on our speaker series, please visit waterfrontforall.ca. Again, thank you very much, Ken Greenberg. Thank you, Ton Schaap. It was a pleasure having you here. With Ken and Ton's permission, we will make, if they agree, we'll make the PDFs of their presentations available, if that's agreeable to both of you.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. We're going to take a look at we are recording this. We may indeed present some of this in video, but we'll probably want to take a look at it and edit it and chop it up, because I don't think, a 2-hour video is probably not going to be the thing that many people want to spend time with for all of it. But we're going to think about that, and we're able to find an effective and efficient way of delivering video recording. We will definitely do so. And if you want to go to our website, we'll update you when and if that happens. And we'll also follow us on Facebook at Waterfront for All on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. And good evening to you, Ton. And we hope we see you again sometime soon. Hope to see sometime in person. Thank you. Good afternoon, Ken. And thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Well.